Do you tie these in with the Native American churches, or is that just?
I don't usually, when I teach 111 mostly, and I tie in JackTales with the imagination of the students and how they construct stories. And actually, we do some JackTales in there because we also teach novels in my class. Our college has a all-campus read. So when I finish that, which I love doing the all-campus read, and I usually finish that. I've already finished our all-campus read for this semester. And then I keep following some sort of literary trail. And the JackTales are very easy for me to do because it's easy for me to show them how relevant the stories are to the way we live, the way people used to live, and the origin of the stories, because they can clearly see the biblical references. And so I like to have those clear paths instead of having students who are 18, 19 years old looking at you going, huh? When you're saying, well, here's Harry Potter, don't you see Cinderella in it? Huh? But it's really easy in the simple folklore to teach so that students can see that. And also the other thing that they can see in JackTales is how the stories are mixed up with the local lore, where people are holding chickens and then they're holding a pig, and Jack is doing something with a knock maul, and he's doing something with awls, and there's something in one of the stories about he's doing peg and awls. And when I did this book for Simon & Schuster, the woman said, "What are you saying?" And I said, "Pegs and awls," over the telephone, and she said, "I wish you would quit using that Appalachian talk with me. You're going to have to spell that." And I said, "No, this is relevant." Ray Hicks said peganals. So that could be a paint color, a peganol paint. But the real translation is pegs and awls. And that's what you use in making shoes. And that's what you use for boring holes and doing various things. And so you can clearly see in these stories that, yeah, it's Appalachian stories because they're all on a mountain, they're always freezing to death, and the northwest wind is always blowing. There are constants in JackTales. So if anybody ever said northwest wind to me, I would say, okay, what JackTale is that? Because it's always the northwest wind. The wind does not blow any other way in a JackTale.
Lynn, I keep thinking as I hear you talk, I keep thinking about Carl Jung. Now, have you followed these?
I have not. Listen, I did mention in here because I have been trying to follow the patterns with Newberry and Fielding, because I've run across references to Jack in Henry Fielding and John Newberry because they allude to Jack. And the minute you know what the JackTales are and you know what the plots of the JackTales are, you can pick up the allusions. But I will do that. Thank you. Because you obviously know.
Well, there's a whole monograph on the trickster figure that might be really interesting.
Well, and the other thing that just really gets me with Jack is if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell's work, which I'm totally can't, I wish I could memorize it. It's like one of those things you keep saying, boy, there's so many things in Joseph Campbell that are right here in all the JackTales. He's nailed them. And so one of my associates said, well, not really the hero's journey, but if you take the JackTales and sort of put them together as though it's a story series, you've pretty much got the hero's journey, because Jack does try to turn back. There are many times in stories that he does attempt to turn back, but he can't turn back. There's something that makes him keep going forward. And the storyteller controls the story regardless of how many hundreds of years it comes down through society. But we do know that the Appalachian people, when the Baptists came in, or Baptists, they get blamed for so much, but when the primitive Baptists came in, and then the Methodists came in, then the Presbyterians came in, and they really wanted people to come to church and come to Jesus, if you will, and they wanted them to be more religious and more respectful and educate their children and not use such bad language. They started preaching against anyone who told anything that was not a Bible story. They preached against people who used instruments because the primitive Baptists felt that any instrument was the work of the devil. And they also preached against people that were going to sing any songs that were not hymns. The hymns had to be sung without any instrumentation, and the stories had to all be Bible stories. So one of the reasons that is my philosophy that the Hicks-Harmon Ward families received the credit from the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress for being the saviors of the stories is because they had one family member whose name was Council Harmon, and he lived from about 1803 to like 1893, which is very unusual for a person to literally see the century. And he kept being thrown out of the church, and he would go. In the old days, they would make you come down, and you would practically be crawling on your knees, and they would admonish you in front of whatever small thing. We're thinking they had modern churches. They were lucky to just have wooden walls and a dirt floor. But Ray said the stories came down through his family about how many times his grandfather or great-great-grandfather was admonished. And then the next thing they would know is that he would be on his front porch playing his homemade banjo again and singing the songs. And so the whole family byword became, if this makes so many people happy, how can it be wrong? How can it be a bad thing? And so that's basically what his great-great-grandfather brought forward along with the stories, was the guts to keep telling them, because he had to go another 120 years before it was acceptable. Interesting. So that's why a lot of people, the JackTales didn't really spread that much outside the Appalachian Mountains. But that's not saying that other families didn't tell them, because certainly Council Harmon had 20 children by 2 wives. And so his children married and moved to Tennessee, and they moved to Kentucky. And there's a lot of family heritage in which one of the wards that married a Hicks worked for Daniel Boone. And he was carrying goods through the mountain, and a couple of the family members were axemen cutting the Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap. And so they have a whole lot of family heritage. Had they not been talkers, we wouldn't know today, because they just kept passing down the talking. So at one time, when Ray Hicks was a boy, he had over 150 first cousins and aunts and uncles living on the same mountain. And some of the first cousins intermarried, and some of the double first cousins intermarried. And so nothing will help your family keep a story any quicker than that much intermarrying. Because they've all heard the same story, and they've all heard the same songs, and they're all wanting to get out of their boredom, and they're all going to the same church. And so, isn't that interesting? That's how, so just in case you've got a few stories you want to say for your family, that's how you do it right there. Otherwise, you're going to have to write it down. So, anyway, I want to get to how anything can be a JackTale. And I brought this, and I'll kind of lead you. I don't know if I have it. We'll have to probably skip page 1 because this is done more or less for elementary school. We'll skip page 19. Go to 19. Let's see how many I brought. I brought as many as I could carry. You want to just listen, or you want to look? Can everybody see? And I'll go through it quickly because I know you had a very long meeting. But this is sort of how the origin of the JackTales. If you'll go to page 20, flip over. And this is done in clay form. It was done for I used my children's names. Max sees that. So I've had my children on stage performing JackTales before. And they can actually do it with me. So, in the middle of the page, on page 20, good morning, Daddy. Good morning, Jack. Take this hoe and go out to the field and dig some taters. It's been raining lately, so spread them out to dry in the sun. Okay, first thing first. All JackTales are going to use the aura of their location. And so they're going to use, in Appalachian Mountains, Jack's going to hoe. He's not going to be driving the Queen's carriage. He's going to be out hoeing something. Yes, Daddy, I'll go to the field after breakfast and hoe taters. Jack walked to the field and started hoeing. Before long, he struck something in the ground. What is this old dirty pot? Why, it's full of gold coins. Now, my daddy said to spread the taters out to dry. These coins are wet. I'll spread them out to dry. Now I'll go get Daddy. He'll be very happy. You found gold? Oh, no, let's hurry back to the tater field. Just as I thought, someone has come along and stolen the gold coins. Oh, Jack, you are so silly. Next time you find anything, wrap it up carefully in one of those tater sacks and bring it home to me. How silly can you get? Let me get these taters out to dry. Now I'll put them in one of those tote sacks and take them home. What is this in the road? Oh, no, it's a dead cat. Now let me take this extra sack and wrap it up and take it home just like Daddy told me to do. Jack, this is a dead cat. You are so silly. When you find anything like this, throw it over the side of the ridge and down the mountain. Now leave the taters for your mama to cook and go on back to the field and dig another bushel. I'll go back to the field and I'll remember what you told me. So he whistles as he walks down the road. Now I'll dig and get some taters home and put them in the cellar house. What's this? I've struck something. I've struck a root. This is really a big old root. Now let me pull it over to the edge. Daddy said that if I found anything, I should just shove it off the mountain. Jack, I thought I'd come to see what you're doing and help you haul the taters home. Why are you looking over the ridge? Oh, I just dug up a large root from the field. I threw it over the ridge just like you said, and now it's out of the way. What? You took firewood and threw it away? That old stump and those roots would have made good kindling for fire building this winter. Next time you find something like that, you chop it up into little pieces and bring it home. Now let me take a load of those taters and you come along shortly. I'll get going. Now what is this? Daddy left his water jar. I need to take it home. Well, wait, Daddy said if I found anything to chop it up into little pieces first. Jack, I can't stand it. Another minute. That's 3 sillies. You'll never find anybody that's sillier than you. You stay here, and what will the adult do? I'll go dig the taters. Young'uns will drive you crazy. Adults are so hard to understand. I did everything my daddy said to do. Okay, so this shows you story origin. Is this not a story you've heard before? My mother in 1920 heard it as a Epaminondas, if you've heard of Epaminondas. And so there are stories of a silly boy in almost every country in the world, just as there are Cinderella type stories in every country in the world. It's like the mystery of stories. You know, what is the origin? How does this happen? But this is how, if I were speaking with somebody from England, would say, oh, you just told Epaminondas. You just twisted it so Epaminondas was taking butter and it melted. And he was carrying milk on his head and it spilled. So the product and the process is in direct relation to the terrain, the history, and the relevance of the area. And so that's why Jack, big point, became every man. He represented every Appalachian person, so that when the Appalachian people started telling those stories, they could relate to it. The other thing that's interesting about the stories is that they could go on for hours. Ray Hicks one time told me that he could go and talk to me night and day for 2 nights without stopping and never tell me the same thing twice. So it's like being good at writing. You develop an ability to write because you're doing what? You're practicing, you're writing. And so these people practiced these stories. They were diligent at it, and they looked forward to getting together to string beans, to dry apples, to dry peaches, to do whatever they chopped slaw, or just to have something to do because they weren't ready to go to bed. What happened at sundown? Did they have lights? No. The earliest people had the fireplace, and sometimes they wanted the fire to get down to a certain wanted it to be low because they're not going to go to bed with a roaring fire, because they learned before the 1600s that you can burn your house down and you are in it. So they had extreme precautions. So when they were sitting up telling stories, it was, as he said, in the chilly of the evening, that they might be wrapped up in a quilt. They might just be sitting around in the dark talking. And his wife said, Rosa Hicks told me one time that when they first got married, he exhausted her talking because he had a new person to tell JackTales to. And that every night it was cold in the winter, and they would get into bed early and get the bed warmed up, and he would just sit up there and tell her JackTales. And so she knows all the JackTales. Okay, now, Or any questions? Would you like a JackTale? I'll tell about the painting. Bob Timberlake, some of you know who Bob Timberlake is, did the painting called Ray's Place. Ray Hicks, the JackTale teller, lived in this house on Old Beach Mountain. It was built in 1911. It's only been painted one time. It's still standing. It no longer looks that way because when Ray passed away, his son built a house right in front of it, which nearly killed me. Because if there's a mecca of storytelling in the South, this would be the mecca of storytelling because he was covered by National Geographic, he was a National Fellow, Smithsonian Fellow, or Heritage Fellow. Every storytelling award that was ever available was given to Ray Hicks. BBC flew in from England, went to his house, or he lived at 4,200 feet. Everybody came to his house. People would read about him in National Geographic and and come and find him. And I would sit on his front porch when people from Colorado would walk down a very steep path. So I have a colleague that does a television show called Roy's Folks, and David Weatherly and I met each other because I called him and said, Ray Hicks has never been on Roy's Folks. And he said, I've never been able to figure out how to get there because it was a one-lane road going straight up to 4,200 feet. You could practically fall off of the mountain. And so I took him up there, and he cameraed Ray, and we all became better friends because of it. So he went back a couple of other times and cameraed Ray. And I kept saying, you know Bob Timberlake needs to do Ray's house. And we would talk back and forth because I didn't know Bob Timberlake well enough to say, hey Bob, go paint Ray Hicks' house. And so one day in March, not Bob called me, but David called me and said, Bob wants to go up Saturday. It was on a Thursday. He said, he wants to go up Saturday. And I went, okay, Saturday's fine. And so he called me back at 9 o'clock and said, Bob just called me and wants to go tomorrow. And so I was like, okay, this is do or die. I've been trying to get him to do this. I had counseled everything at 9 o'clock at night. That makes a lot of people happy. And it was snowing like all get out. And there's a whole story about how I was driving a little Honda Civic and my mother in her 80s, and it's snowing a blizzard, and it's a one-lane road, and you could easily just go right off the mountain. And my mother was so nervous that a guy came up behind me in a four-wheel drive pickup truck, and I just stopped and waded through the snow, and I said, do you know where Ray Hicks lives? And he says, oh yeah, everybody knows where he lives. And I said, can I follow you? And because if I get stuck, you could actually pull me out. And so I followed him with the snow hitting up under the car, and my mother was going, oh, that's real clever, now that we're going to get there, but how are we going to get out? So